Many of us read books like language is a tool, something we can put down and move away from. But in James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, he argues that we can level up language to more than just tools and make them events, make them a way to craft our lives as we will, blurring the lines between idea and action. And he does this primarily through his wordplay, which I think can be best exemplified by the use of portmanteau words, in which we are combining various words from both English and other languages, and stressing the extent of resemblance in order to maximize the usefulness of our textual economy. The space on the page and the space in our mind is used to its utmost extent such that we can pack as much significatory value into as small of a space as possible. A scholar I once read, who I unfortunately cannot remember at this time, brought up the concept of a totem word, which is something that I haven't heard a lot in academic discourse, but I think it very much describes Joyce's wordplay very well. Because there are a number of different neologisms, a number of different created words. Some of these can be, for example, created proper names, as in a neologism. Or it can be a portmanteau word where you take two complete words and you either just stick them right next to each other or cut off the beginning and ends, but they're still very clearly there. You also have onomatopoeia, where you create a new word that is intended to sound like what it signifies or represents. Or there's the totem word. And the best example of an analogy for what a totem word is the black monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, when 2001 opens up, we see a number of early hominids trying to struggle for survival in the desert. And after a few fighting scenes and the discovery of tools, they stumble upon this incantatory, mysterious monolith, which really bears its own stamp of significance. It wears it on its sleeve, and yet it is not self-sufficient. It demands interrogation, encounter, perhaps praise. This is the mysterious function of the monolith that returns several times throughout 2001, bookending the beginning and end of the film, as well as appearing in the middle, where human beings, later after their hominid ancestors, stumble upon it as well. And when they get too close, it gives off this uncomfortable and displeasing sound that really petrifies them. Thus, the function of a totem word, like the monolith, does not depend on having a final grasp of its significance, because it instantly assails one with its function, but rather it depends on the fact that its function is as an instigator of a process of searching, probing, interrogation, and elaboration. In the movie, the monolith stands at certain key points in history, acting as a mark of progress through history and all of the various ups and downs that it entails. Totem words, therefore, blur the line between abstractions and events, between the purely symbolic, which is ahistorical, which sits on a page forever and really doesn't do anything, and the political, which is historical, which is social, which is mediated by people who do things. Therefore, these words force us to make the word flesh through analysis, thus making it real and connecting it to the real lives, which have an ever-developing sense of concerns, values, beliefs, and goals. And indeed, this represents Joyce's project in Finnegans Wake. As is the case in Ulysses and Portrait of the Artist and even Dubliners, he's trying to connect the ideal value of language to its real function as it serves to embody the everyday life, as it serves to open up onto the social stage. And in fact, the monolith, as it plays its function in 2001, is very similar to the function of thunder for Giambattista Vico, one of the principal philosophical contributors to Joyce's theoretical concerns. Because for Vico, the beginning of history begins with God sending down thunder, which acts as the voice of God entering into and thus beginning history, forcing early primates into hiding in caves in order to find protection. And indeed, this forces us to find ways of communication, ways of forming symbolic and systematic relationships with one another, which can be best exemplified with language. Thus, the monolith really represents the significatory value of language en masse. And in this lecture, I would like to give a survey of the portmanteau and totem words used in Finnegans Wake. And I want to give exactly how Joyce is able to compact lots of different words into a very small amount of space, oftentimes serving as very key ways to grasp Joyce's textual project. And I want to offer this as, for someone who maybe hasn't read Finnegans Wake, as a helpful strategy for reading the book. Look for these types of word clusters when reading Finnegans Wake to find some key terms that you can latch on to, which allow Joyce's texts to temporarily shimmer amidst the chaos of the surrounding milieu. Speaking of our early hominid ancestors as pictured in 2001: A Space Odyssey, Joyce calls the Finnegans Wake a Neanderthal tale, which is to say, a tale of the Neanderthals and other early human ancestors or early humans, because this is also about Adam and Eve and the first members of our species, meandering through history, trying to find their way. Finnegans Wake is verbigracious, which is to say, it is filled with grace and empathy, but also with verbs which do things. Just as people do things, these verbs actually do things, jumping out of the page and giving us a mosaic, which is to say, a mosaic of music. An apt descriptor for certain interpretations, Finnegans Wake can be seen as a panto joke, which is to say, a joke of all coming from panto, the Greek for all. The reader, or even the writer, or the main character HCE of Finnegans Wake can be called a philosophist, which is to say, a phallus philosopher, a philosopher who uses the significatory power of the phallus as it is seen in psychoanalysis, for example, the sword of identity itself. Joyce in Finnegans Wake is a word wounder, splitting open our conception of language and finding the gaps in between in order to fill it with the variety of association we are typically kept from establishing and recognizing. This word proteiform is a very good one for Finnegans Wake. Think about Proteus, right? A character who can shapeshift in Greek mythology. The form of Finnegans Wake itself is Protean like this, constantly shifting styles and affective capabilities and associations. And Finnegans Wake is all about a crime, real or imaginary. Some kind of crime has happened, which is really plaguing the mind of HCE, or whoever the dreamer is, but I believe it to be HCE, although you may say that that's a little normal. But there's this word entomophilos, right? Ento, meaning insects, phil, for love of, and also lust, right? As in lusting over something. Thus, HCE is lusting over insects, but a famous turnaround that occurs in Finnegans Wake is insect and incest. Insects are the sublimated way of talking about the incest, which likely is occurring either imaginarily or, in fact, between HCE and his daughter, Isabel. Thus, Finnegans Wake is a sex mosaic of nymphosis, right? It is a mosaic of sexual innuendos concerning the nymph. Easy. And it takes place in and regarding the aureolopos, which is to say the aureoles, the ears, and also the Ouroboros, which is a typical mythical figure for the cyclical return of history, for the concept of eternity and recurrence and repetition. Finnegans Wake is a book flood. It itself is a combination of loads and loads of books which have been packed into this thing. It is like we've taken mud or snow and we packed it together tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter, such that we're almost getting rid of the holes by filling in the holes with more and more information and associations. This book flood takes place in a chaosmos, one of the concepts of Finnegans Wake that has been picked up by Deleuze and Guattari. The chaosmos is a cosmos of chaos, in which there is no preordained order, and indeed, order is a rarity. What is common is chaos and change, sublation and sublimation. And the common state between humans is that of inter-misunderstanding, right? Misunderstanding between people. Considering that Finnegans Wake is a dream, an apt description of it may be a steady monologi of the interiors, which is to say, a monologue concerning one guy's interior thoughts, or dreams, or desires. One of the best descriptions of Joyce's project concerning the mind is indeed a sexophonologistic schizophrenesis, which in fact is eerily similar to Deleuze and Guattari's concept of schizoanalysis, right? We are using phono, sound, the logos of sound, so the study of sound, and the way that it relates to sexual innuendos and sexual energy, and we are seeing how that is embodied in the schizophrenic mind. The mind in which there is no preordained order, but rather there is a chaos and flurry and flux of images and affects and ideas, which come together every once in a while to form a stable mosaic. Finnegans Wake is an anti-teleological book in which history has no set end and in fact no end at all. Thus he speaks of liberté, fraternité, and qualité. This is a riff on the French for liberty, fraternity, and equality. But here, fraternity is fraternity, but also for eternity, and also the German froh for gay or excited. Joyce's chaosmos is a kaleidoscope, which is to say a landscape kaleidoscoping inwards and outwards, fore and aft, combining elements in constant new configurations. There is no absolute stability or identity, but only relative stability, relative identity, and homeostasis. Among the themes of Finnegans Wake is reconciliation. Reconciliation between oneself and one's ideals, between oneself and one's cultures or nations' ideals, and indeed reconciliation between man and woman. Thus we have the word himself, which is both him and she united through help and himself. Thus this potential for reconciliation with HCE and his wife and HCE and himself is latent within himself. Finnegans Wake's linguistic movement takes place metamorphally, which is to say through metaphor and metamorphosis, but blurred because the mouth is full. Considering Finnegans Wake's relationship to the Gospels and to all sorts of hymns and sayings, it can be seen as a collection of beatitubes, which is to say the Beatitudes from the Gospels, but also the tubes of the inner ear, the way that sound gets turned into concepts in the ear and through the neuronal impulses that come from the ear to the brain. And among Joyce's social concerns is that of metropolyarchaealization, which is to say, the way the metropolitan hierarchizes and organizes people, the way city life or modernity, as is typical for people of his day, is concerned with social organization. We might think of Max Weber's concept of rationalization, the way modernity takes various symbolic acts and rationalizes them, takes away, for example, the notion of incompleteness. And this creates a state of status quo, which is to say, a static status quo, because things have been turned into statues. They've been solidified through the social organization that reduces movement, flows, and complexity. And the words and messaging and structure of Finnegans Wake might aptly be called posonal, which is to say a puzzle, which is tonal, and this is also related to the German word Posaune for trombone. Thus, we have a book which itself makes and prompts sound and acts as an instrument for the creation of sound, a medium through which the puzzle of the self, of our concepts, of identity, can become tonal and therefore become flesh and become an action. And it is no secret that Finnegans Wake is scriblative, which is to say, a scribbling of expletives. It is filled with innuendos, with dark and uncomfortable connotations, and language that you wouldn't want mom to hear. Indeed, it is filled with innuendation, which is to say, it is inundated with innuendos, right? Think of the way that to inundate is to flood, the way that we are flooding the page with desire. Now, this deluge of desire is often uncomfortable because it brings back recurrent thoughts of, for example, sin. And as is typical of the human condition, things that we don't want to do, we continue to do oftentimes. Thus, Joyce says, rinse them out and astone along with you. Where did I stop? Never stop. Continue aeration. You're not there yet. I am still waiting. Garon, garon. Right? So we go on and we continue to err or to sin. I think of, for example, Paul in the Bible, who has this continuous thorn in his side, right? And he continues to err, probably, through some mysterious sin. A great example of the compacted nature of Joyce's textual economy is this word alibi, which indeed can fairly straightforwardly be said to be referring to the word alibi, but it also is saying goodbye, and it also has I as in eyeball in there, but it also has Allah, the Arabic word for God. And any of these words can be seen as a microcosm, which is to say a microcosm of the human condition, since all of these words often relate to very universal themes, even though they might seem to have only a very particular message bound to them. And at the same time, there's something that one can fall into endlessly as Blockchen void, as he calls it. Therefore, Joyce's style can very well be called innovation, which is to say innovation, but also novia, as in the Spanish for boyfriend or girlfriend, or it can also refer to the Spanish via, which means way or line. Thus, this can be seen as a way of following a line of flight, following a way and creating a way to love. This is a creation of love itself, which is to say language and the ideas that accompany it. And Joyce could do this for a lifetime, a loafing lifetime, a lifetime spent absorbed in language, loafing around, not concerned with the culture's or the nation's concerns with what one ought to do. This disregard for culture is one of the reasons that Finnegans Wake may not have done so well, considering that it is filled with latrines, which is to say latrines of letters. letters filled with the scum of society, all the sayings of the common folk and the poor folk, but also filled with the kind of stuff that we wish we could just flush down the toilet, that we could forget. The horrors of the past, for example, various instances of British colonialism, but also, one of the things that Joyce wants to stress, the coerced nature of the fall, the way that we were predestined to fall, and thus the injustice that is at the heart of the forgetfulness of theology that tries to create a positive reason why one ought to love God instead of disdain him. Now, whomsoever Finnegans Wake may concern doesn't really matter. The question, to whom does Finnegans Wake concern, is a mere whim. Anyone could read it. But also, whom are we thinking of or referring to when we talk about the dreamer is also a mere whim. It could very well be any of us, because indeed many of the thoughts expressed in Finnegans Wake are the kinds of things that anyone could think. One of the more postmodern fixations of Finnegans Wake is that of fixation, which is to say, a fixation on the falsification of fiction. The way that fiction crafts a narrative, the way that truth is created. As Joyce says, we are circumveloped by obscuritads, which is to say, all around us in circles and circles that continue to move and ebb, we are enveloped by obscurities which threaten us oftentimes. Finnegans Wake is consistently concerned with the fall, the way that we fall from our expectations, our desires, our hopes, and our goals. And this can be seen on page 247, where we have two portmanteau words that go directly against each other. The first being immaculacy, which is to say immaculate eyesight, because this is both the word immaculate and the macula, which is the most clear-seeing part of the eye. But go down a few lines and we see the word clear-obscure, in which clarity and obscurity directly fight for room on the page, so much so that they come into contact with one another and create an uncomfortable discontinuity, in which we wish these were two separate words, but in fact they are the same word, the very paradox that plagues Finnegans Wake. Finnegans Wake is an ecumenical text. It's concerned with everybody, with all of its readers, and with the potential for creation. It's concerned with the mad long ramp of mankind's parliaments, the learned lack learning, merciless as wonderful. Where here we can see that mankind is combined with the German manchmal, which means sometimes. As in, we only sometimes measure up to the kinds of things that we draft and put into law in parliaments. Why is this the case? Well, because we are often absent-minded, which is to say absent-minded and also obscene-minded. And at the same time, this is giving reference to the German gemein for both common as well as nasty, vulgar, or vicious. Thus, our thoughts are so plagued with both the commonalities of what we expect to think and the uncomfortable nastiness that so often enters our mind that leads us to absent and distracted-minded thoughts. Oftentimes, we try to paint over this by the orthodox, which is to say, the orthodoxy of art. But this doesn't always work, because as we can see, Joyce in Finnegans Wake likes to corrupt orthodoxy, likes to see how art itself is opposed to orthodoxy, strives on heterodoxy, and in fact the absence or the oblique skirting around doxa altogether. Thus Finnegans Wake is a mapamund concerning a late wiser, which is to say a map of the Mund, German for mind, concerning a late wiser, that is to say late riser, said with a lisp, and also a sense of belatedly coming to knowledge, belatedly becoming the wiser, belatedly coming to resurrection or redemption. This is done not through psychoanalysis, but cycloanalysis, which is to say an investigation of the annals of the mind that cycle out of control in a nauseous, fluid, overflowing state. Finnegans Wake, therefore, can be seen as a totem text, where every word is a veritotem, which is to say, coming from the Latin veritas for truth, which is itself connected to the enunciatory capacity of the totem word. A very interesting word here is Microcosms, which is to say, we're concerned with the microbes of the human mind, and also the distinction between micro and macro, how the macro, such as the social or the ecological, is related to the micro of the unconscious and of the individual. But this text is also a sort of Mobius strip. A Mobius strip is one continual surface with one side and no end and no bounds, which indeed is a perfect descriptor of history. It's a shape that bends our sense of conclusion, of causality, of the necessity for an event to be connected to a finite causal chain ending in a first event. Instead, we have a constant cycle that is constantly mulling over and turning around and twisting around itself. Finnegans Wake is one giant phenomenon, which is to say a phenomenology of phenomena, but where the phenomena in question are the auditory phenomena of phonemes, of basic sounds that can be put in constant relations that go past the bounds of one language or the other, or indeed multiple languages, because every language is shot through with confusions, with overlapping sections, such that there is no clear delineation between any 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. languages. One of the more Hegelian aspects of Finnegans Wake is the concern with idea-real history, which is to say the difference between the ideal and the real, the way that the ideal becomes real through history and in history, but also with the sidereal viewpoint. Sidereal being with respect to distant stars. For example, we can talk about a sidereal day, which is a day not from the perspective of Earth, but sidereal being day with respect to the stars in a certain system. So it's a more systematic concern for understanding history that goes beyond the local presuppositions. Therefore, this may be seen as a rewriting of the Hegelian conception of dialectical history, such that we keep the dialectic and we keep a sense of historical progression, but get rid of the teleology, get rid of the Anglocentric and anthropocentric aspects of any historical concern taken in the English language. Finnegans Wake is thus the semper-eternal spiel, which is to say, a spiel or a speech, which, coming from the Spanish siempre, for always, is eternally ramifying, repeating, and changing through that repetition into the future. It is the eternal word, the speech which can't help but become real, become in general. Going back to a theme earlier, Finnegans Wake is concerned with letterines, which is to say latrines of letters. One of my favorite invented adjectives to describe Finnegans Wake is an imbroglia, which is to say an imbroglio, or a chaotically uncomfortable and confused situation concerning the umbra, which is to say the darkest part of a shadow which has been cast by an opaque object, but also concerning the umbilical cord, which is to say the gestatory periods of life, where life is developing and confirmed through its growth. Thus, life is a continual conversation, a continual umbroglia, a conversation in the dark, constantly trying to find the light of surety. Finnegans Wake takes place in and regarding Timbuktu, which is to say, in Timbuktu, but it is the hymn of Timbuktu, Timbuktu being in Mali, in the middle of the desert. Thus, Finnegans Wake itself is the hymn of the desert, the place where we have gone beyond the values of our culture, into the dead of night. I'm thinking of the final passage from Nietzsche's Human All Too Human, where he speaks of the wanderer who willingly goes out of the gates of the city into the darkness of the nights. And even though he hears the howling of the wolves and sees the gates of the city, even though he chooses to go in, he sees that the city itself is a desert within a desert, that old values are of no help, that we are always fighting against death, against staticness, and we are always trying to sing into that desert, to make it alive through the Word made flesh. Finnegans Wake may often appear as a valsehood, which is to say valse for dance, a falsehood. It is a dance of constant events which very well could be false, and indeed it doesn't necessarily matter the truth or falsity of them in that regard. It matters what they mean and what they do to help HCE deal with his guilt, with his problems, with his confusions. Thus, Finnegans Wake is at heart an emanation from and concerning HCE, which is to say an emanation from his mind, but also it is an omni-nation. It is a nation of pluralities and of all, which could apply to us all, because it is a superposition. This being the quantum mechanical term superposition, in which a single place is pregnant with multiplicity. And at the same time, it's a great place to be. It's a great place to be stuck in and concerned with language, with Simpersprich, which is to say simple speech, also simple preaching, and also coming from the German sympathisch or the Spanish simpático for happy or jolly, right? So we're concerned with the joyful science, right? Die fröhliche Wissenschaft, as Nietzsche put it. And one of the concerns motivating character change in Finnegans Wake is the idea of self-love. Thus, we have the concept of honorable here, which is honoring the one, which is me, but also one as in the general concept of one does ... Thus, it is being able to honor the humanity in oneself, but also the oniric, which is to say that concerning dreams. We're learning to honor and respect the validity of our own thoughts. And this search takes place cyclums cyclorums, which is to say, from the Latin, in secula seculorum, forever and ever. And it is cyclical. It's always coming back, but always the same anew, which cannot do but renew differently. Finnegans Wake is thus semiliminal, which is to say it is a seminal text of Joyce, and it is in a liminal state as Joyce is going through this hyperfluxy development. And Finnegans Wake is concerning semen. Considering that we're in a dream, we're concerned with all the senses. Thus, it is verbivoco-visual, which is to say both verbal, vocal, and visual. And that is exactly what Finnegans Wake is. It is concerned with the verbal way in which speech is uttered, because we see Joyce copying accents all the time. It is also vocal, because, once again, it is concerned with the way that we speak, that we utter. And it's also visual, concerned with the way that we replicate that on the page. It is concerned with orthography, with the relationship of word to space. All of this taking place in the Jehumosphere, which is to say the atmosphere of Jehannam, or Gehenna in Hebrew. Jahannam is the Arabic word for hell, and Gehenna is the Hebrew word. So we're in the atmosphere of hell itself, a hell on earth, which is the hell in HCE's head, all the things he doesn't want to face. Thus, Finnegans Wake is concerned with a special kind of ideology, which is to say, not the logos of ideas as some general thing, but rather ideo, which is to say, self logos, the private logos of one's thoughts. This, in a way, is a very similar affront to psychoanalysis as that done by Deleuze-Guattari, where instead of assuming that the unconscious must respond to and constrict itself to certain forms, we see that each individual is a private and social collection of a number of facts that constrain the way that their thoughts run. And this is not a universal structure, but rather the particular structure of a person who should be understood on their own terms, with all their complexities and their contradictions. And indeed, this is not the most comfortable place to be, that being in Old Confusalem, in a Jerusalem which is not an ideal city here, but rather a confused state, where we don't know if this is where we should be or not. And in fact, these thoughts in Old Confusalem often contains. Not only that, but God himself contains, which is to say contaminates us, and also contains us, and retroactively constrains our actions. Thus, as an affront to orthodoxy and theology and cultural acceptability itself, Finnegans Wake is about venerections, about venerating erections, venerating the virility of sexuality, of desire, of identity, of selfhood. Finnegans Wake is a collection of murmurandums, which is to say a memorandum of murmurs at random of the mind. And we can see this inverted theology that Finnegans Wake really exemplifies with this word maktub, which is a relationship to the Arabic word mektub, which literally means it is written, but it's a way of talking about destiny or the letter itself, right? Think about like the word or the logos in Christianity. It's a similar thing here, right? Because the Quran is God's word itself. It represents our capacities, our relationships to God, except Joyce's Quran comes from the muck of society. It is a tub filled with this muck, just as the Liffey itself, which bisects Dublin, is filled with the fecal matter and the urine of the city. And Joyce's text, through its anti-theological approach, also maintains a political connection. For example, he writes, "Where you conceal me, you mayst forced gauge my bribes." So the concept of force here is related to this word conceal, which is both to conceal and can see, but also to cancel. Therefore, we have thematized in just one simple word, this conceal, the association between surveillance and confinement, which is expanded in the sentence itself. In a very Heideggerian way, Finnegans Wake is concerned with the relationship between the ontological, which is to say that concerning being, and the existential or hermeneutic, which is to say that of existence and interpretation that goes along with that existence, with this word ontohum, which may be seen as into or onto whom, but also it is the ontological combined with the whom of my existence. To whom should I comport myself? Or to whom should I direct my love? One of my favorite portmanteau words is that of aletheometry, which is coming from the Greek aletheia, which is truth or disclosure. It's the capacity of truth to reveal itself. But this is the study of aletheia, but also a theology. As my good friend Dr. Rolf Goebel put it, it is the fleeting measuring of the revealing or disclosing of the divine. the temporary manners through which the divine can be seen, heard, and experienced, and also the process itself of disclosing our own truth, of our own being concerning what it means to be. All of this might seem a little overwhelming, but my hope is that this should show you how Joyce's textual economy works concretely. The way that he tends to combine and truncate and expand words to give them much more meaning than the space on the page would seem to initially convey. While this can often require a lot of knowledge in, for example, different languages, of which German and Spanish are really the only ones I can claim even the slightest modicum of knowledge about, nevertheless, it can be exciting just to go through the text and find these words densely compacted with meaning. I hope that this has given you a survey of some of these words and prompted you to read the text and find your own. That being said, that's it for this lecture. Consider checking out any of the other ones I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it means a lot and takes a lot of pressure off me, but no pressure yourself. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.